With more and more exposure to the genre recently, I've decided that my eventual first commercial game will probably be an adventure game. I happen to really enjoy the surreal, the symbolic, and the psychological, so it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who's actually heard of the game that someday I'll view Outcry as an inspiration for my work. It's an ambitious point-and-clicker that relies on a very strong, very fantastical story and world that reach beyond what we perceive as physical reality. Unfortunately, though, it doubles as a cautionary tale that documents pretty much everything that an adventure game shouldn't do. Outcry is an ambitious game with a story to tell that is as human as it is paranormal, but it almost always has major problems that keep it from playing effectively, sometimes keeping its puzzles and environments from remaining approachable, sometimes relevant, and sometimes interesting. Outcry opens as you visit your brother after having received a very excited letter from him, only to find his apartment abandoned, completely repurposed to hold a large psychedelic isolation machine powerful enough to have apparently transported him to another world. The entire concept is rooted in real, or at least seemingly real, history and scientific discoveries. The downside to this is how some sloppy execution affects the game's accessibility. Of the 3.5 to 4 hours the whole thing took me to complete, about an hour was devoted to just setting up the machine and reading about dolmens, infrasound, and botany in between the pages and pages of information I needed to consume just to figure out how I should turn a valve or flick a series of switches. But the fact that there's a lot of reading involved, at least in the first hour, isn't that much of a problem until the writing is taken into account. It's a Russian game, so Russians would naturally have few issues with the notes in their native version, but the English translation is perpetually a few notches below the worst you can imagine in a commercial title. You know how me gusta in Spanish and mi piace in Italian mean the same thing as I like it, but translate directly as it pleases me? Russian has a lot of that passive structure in its sentences, and it often feels completely out of place when translated directly into English. And that's exactly how the entire game feels, like it was fed verbatim into translation software by a publisher run exclusively by non-Anglophones.
It is demanded to gain the head of water in the fourth canal for one valve turnover at the expense of the same head reduction in the second canal.
That entire jumble took me a while to figure out. The diary entry is referring to a series of 4 valves that need to be turned a certain number of times. And with all the bullshit removed, it says, I need to turn the 4th valve forward 1 notch and the 2nd valve back 1 notch. Though it's one of the worst examples of quality writing in the game, with all the troublesome grammar, Russian punctuation, mishandled articles, and obscure vocabulary, not so much of the script is any easier to understand. After the introduction ends, the game puts less emphasis on pages and pages of prose, but it doesn't actually improve all that much. It just sort of replaces one type of convolution for another commonly known as pixel hunting, and it keeps a lot of its puzzles seemingly impenetrable. Outcry's environments are nicely detailed with a very run-down finish to them, but this ends up making puzzles a lot more tedious. Outdoor environments have a very bleached feel to them, and conversely indoor environments are very shadowy. The visuals make the game tonally distinct, but they impede the actual process of finding objects that are necessary for operating stuff in the world. In many cases, the most puzzle-critical objects or pieces of information are images of very mundane, common items that blend in with all of the static debris on the ground. With the regular usage of randomly found junk, puzzle solving can feel like MacGyvering a solution, but with barely any thought involved because you're not actually doing anything other than clicking everywhere and picking up whatever can be picked up. Outcry's method of storytelling also has major issues. Upon entering the other world, everything you see and do has relevance to your brother's diaries, his personal history, and the real world. But the connections between gameplay and narrative fade slowly away not long after they're at their strongest. One of the promises the game makes involves the opportunity to turn back time and change events for the better, cryostasis style, to give yourself and your brother closure. Barring a small tutorial of sorts, this kind of puzzle happens once throughout the entire game. Even though the puzzle itself isn't actually good, thanks to a very crucial clue being obscured in a dark environment, of course, it's a remarkable idea that the developers just threw away as though it couldn't be reused. Matters seem to only become more and more irrelevant from then on, as later environments become only tangentially related to the story at best. By the end, the symbolism, if any even remains, is so far out there that it becomes hard to care about your own brother's diaries. And this is a pretty big shame because a few of the puzzles are pretty high quality. The puzzles are pretty varied, but they almost always involve figuring out how to operate some kind of abstract machinery to advance to a new level. Some of the machines in the game are undoubtedly genius contraptions, but they simply don't mix in with the story. I'm going to refrain from divulging any specific spoilers just in case anybody who watches this is a computer game masochist. But suffice it to say that during the final puzzle, you read diary entries about your brother building a toy steamboat as a child, while you tune a musical instrument the size of a windmill and pollinate flowers. It's probably the best puzzle in the entire game design-wise, but at the same time it doesn't make any attempt to actually fit in a game that relies on a strong, symbolic experience related to its story in order to survive. The whole probable lack of meaning in the final few levels turns out to really damage the narrative itself too. The game ends with a very thought-provoking revelation that it ties into some events in your brother's life that he had hinted at early on in his diary, but that's about all the credit I can give to the ending. The game ends very abruptly because the dissonant puzzles don't lead up to it. They're all probably just a bunch of surreal ideas that the designers wanted to include but never reconciled with the vision they had for the story. And this tragic lack of reconciliation rings true throughout Outcry. It's got an absolutely fantastic premise, and one of the most interesting stories I've come across in a game, but it often gets so caught up in its thinking man's narrative and world that it doesn't produce proper thinking man's gameplay to match. While I have a pretty high pain tolerance when it comes to language, I'm also fairly certain that the horrible translation is enough for most to immediately dismiss a game like this. Outcry has its good moments, and it's got some admirable creative drive and vision behind it that I dream of surpassing someday, but it has far too many neglectful, gaping flaws to excuse.
It leads to immobilization, and occasionally to incoherent visions, sort of febrile delirium.